The Northwest Territory, stretching from the banks of the Ohio River to the shores of the Great Lakes, was a land of untapped potential, a vast frontier where nature ruled and few Europeans had set foot. For early Americans, this land represented more than empty wilderness. It was a canvas on which the fledgling nation could project its ambition, securing both economic opportunity and geopolitical influence. The forests were dense and teeming with wildlife, the rivers flowed like arteries of trade and sustenance, and the soil, rich and fertile, promised harvests that could feed generations. It was a land that had been shaped and maintained for centuries by the indigenous nations who lived here. Their societies adapted to its rhythms, their knowledge of its rivers, forests, and plains unmatched by any newcomer. In the late 18th century, as the Revolutionary War faded into history, attention began to turn westward. Veterans of the Continental Army, many of them granted land in lieu of unpaid salaries, saw the Northwest as a chance to rebuild their lives and secure a future in a nation they had fought to create. But it wasn't only Americans who noticed. The fur trade had long made the region a hub of international commerce. French traders, followed by the British, had established posts and networks connecting the continent's interior to markets as far away as Europe. Fur, timber, and other resources made the Northwest Territory a valuable prize, and its rivers and lakes were the highways that would allow whoever controlled them to dominate trade and influence the wider continent. The indigenous nations of the region, including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and Ottawa, had long navigated these dynamics with skill. They traded with Europeans, but were also prepared to resist encroachment. Their societies were structured, resilient, and sophisticated, with diplomatic alliances and networks extending across the region. To understand the Northwest expansion, one must recognize that it was not a simple matter of empty land being claimed. It was contested territory, where every river bend, forest clearing, and village could become a strategic point in a much larger struggle. Early settlers faced daunting challenges. The wilderness was unforgiving, with harsh winters, swarming insects, and unfamiliar terrain that tested every skill and survival instinct. But with every farm planted and every settlement established, the face of the Northwest began to change. Surveyors plotted grids of townships, laying the foundations for a new society. Towns grew slowly but steadily, often centered around trading posts or riverside landings, while forts dotted strategic points to protect settlers and assert the authority of the United States government. Life on the frontier was unpredictable and dangerous, yet it was also rich with opportunity, drawing people willing to take risks in the hope of carving out a better life. Economic prospects were a driving force. Timber from the dense forests fed the growing demand for construction materials in the eastern states, while the fur trade connected settlers and indigenous peoples to global markets. The fertile soil promised grains, vegetables, and livestock, offering not just subsistence but the potential for wealth. Rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi became lifelines, transporting goods to distant markets and connecting the frontier to the wider world. The region's strategic importance was clear even then. Control over these waterways meant control over trade and movement, and by extension, influence over the continent's economic and political future. Yet the Northwest Territory was more than just resources and geography. It was a testing ground for governance and policy. The federal government faced the unprecedented challenge of managing a vast, sparsely populated region. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided a framework for organized settlement, laying out how territories could become states while protecting certain civil liberties and, controversially, prohibiting slavery. This legislation reflected the ambition of the new nation, a blueprint for orderly expansion that balanced federal oversight with local autonomy. It also highlighted the tensions inherent in expansion, how to respect the rights of those who already lived on the land while pursuing national interests and encouraging settlement. The allure of the Northwest was not purely economic or political. It was also a cultural and symbolic frontier. For a young America emerging from colonial dependence and war, the Northwest represented possibility and identity. It was a place where the principles of the new nation could be tested, where the ideals of self-governance and individual liberty could take root in the soil of the frontier. Yet this idealism often collided with reality. settlers' ambitions clashed with indigenous sovereignty, economic desires fueled territorial disputes, and the presence of other European powers ensured that the Northwest was never simply an internal American matter. As settlers pushed into the land, rivers and trails became lifelines connecting distant communities. Trading posts evolved into small towns, forts became centers of governance, and the forest slowly yielded to farmland. Every cleared field and constructed road was a small victory for the vision of an expanding United States. But the frontier remained a contested space, a theater of negotiation, resistance, and sometimes violence, where the fates of individuals, communities, and nations intertwined. Understanding the Northwest Territory, therefore, is not merely a matter of geography. It is an exploration of ambition, conflict, and resilience, a microcosm of the forces that shaped the young nation. By the end of this chapter, the viewer should grasp why the Northwest was so important. It was a land of opportunity, wealth, and strategic advantage, but also a land of contest where indigenous nations, settlers, and foreign powers all had stakes in its future. It set the stage for the conflicts, diplomacy, and expansion that would define America's journey in the decades to come, and it reveals why this frontier, often forgotten in popular history, played such a critical role in the making of the United States. The Northwest Territory was not just a land of opportunity for Americans. It was a chessboard where global powers played a quiet but intense game of influence. Even as the United States celebrated its hard-won independence, European nations still viewed the vast interior of North America as a prize, and the Northwest in particular was a jewel rich with resources, strategic waterways, and trade potential. France, Britain, Spain, and even distant Russia had stakes in the region, their ambitions intersecting and often colliding with the young nation's vision for expansion. To fully understand the struggle over this land, we must recognize that the Northwest was never empty. It was inhabited by sophisticated indigenous nations and monitored by global powers who had long mapped its rivers, forests, and trade routes. Britain, the most dominant force in North America after the Revolutionary War, maintained a subtle yet persistent presence in the Northwest. Although the Treaty of Paris in 1783 technically ceded the territory to the United States, British forts remained in key locations, and their influence over native nations persisted. For Britain, controlling the fur trade and maintaining alliances with indigenous groups was a way to keep the United States in check, preserving leverage in North America even after losing formal control. British traders and military advisors supplied weapons, established trading posts, and fostered political alliances with tribes such as the Shawnee, Miami, and Wyandot, creating a network of influence that complicated American settlement efforts. France's role was more commercial than military, yet its legacy in the region remained potent. French traders had been present in the Great Lakes and Mississippi regions for over a century, and their fur trading networks linked the Northwest to Europe. Even after France's direct colonial ambitions waned following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, French influence persisted through trade partnerships, marriage alliances with indigenous peoples, and the cultural imprint left on the region. For France, the Northwest was a place to maintain economic relevance and compete indirectly against Britain, ensuring that European rivalries continued to shape North American affairs. Spain, controlling territories further south along the Mississippi River and in Louisiana, also had a stake in the Northwest. Though its influence was more indirect, Spain's control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River allowed it to affect trade and settlement patterns throughout the region. The Mississippi was a critical artery, and whoever could control its flow could dominate commerce, moving goods between the interior and the Gulf of Mexico. Spanish officials kept a watchful eye on the United States movements, negotiating treaties, and exerting pressure when possible to ensure that the young nation did not gain unchecked control of the interior. Russia, though distant, cast a shadow from the Northwest. Its expansion along the Pacific coast in Alaska and trade ambitions in the Pacific Northwest meant that no part of the continent was entirely isolated from global competition. Though Russian influence in the immediate Ohio and Great Lakes region was minimal, their presence illustrated the growing interconnectedness of North American geopolitics. Every European power, from London to Paris to Madrid, had interests that intersected with America's plans for the Northwest. turning what might have seemed like a domestic frontier into a theater of international strategy. The tension between these powers was not always overtly militaristic, but often manifested in diplomacy, alliances, and the subtle manipulation of local populations. The Northwest was a land of intersecting interests where native nations were not passive observers, but active participants, skillfully negotiating trade agreements, military alliances, and territorial boundaries to preserve their autonomy. Leaders like Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee recognized the strategic importance of European powers and used these relationships to resist American encroachment. The result was a complex web of competition, where every decision by settlers, traders, or diplomats could ripple across multiple nations and cultures. American policymakers were acutely aware of these challenges. The federal government faced the daunting task of asserting authority in a territory contested by foreign powers and native nations alike. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was not only a tool for organizing settlement, but also a statement of sovereignty, signaling that the United States intended to govern and protect its western lands. Military expeditions, surveying missions, and the establishment of forts were as much about deterring European interference as they were about ensuring the safety of settlers. This dual-purpose internal governance and external security defined much of America's strategy in the Northwest. Trade and commerce were central to the competition. Furs, timber, and agricultural products connected the Northwest to global markets, making economic control just as important as territorial control. European powers sought to maintain their economic footholds, while American settlers and entrepreneurs aimed to establish new trade networks that would consolidate the young nation's influence. Rivers, lakes, and port towns became contested points where the ambitions of multiple nations converged. Whoever controlled the trade routes could shape the flow of goods, the loyalties of indigenous nations, and the balance of power across the continent. Conflicts did erupt, both directly and indirectly. Small-scale skirmishes between settlers and native nations often involved European advisors or traders, blurring the lines between local and international disputes. Diplomacy, bribery, and negotiation were tools as frequently employed as muskets and cannons. Treaties were signed, broken, and renegotiated, reflecting the fluid nature of control and the difficulty of imposing authority over a vast, contested landscape. Each action by settlers, native leaders, or foreign powers contributed to a delicate and often unstable equilibrium, highlighting the complexity of expansion beyond simple conquest. The competition for the Northwest Territory illustrates a broader lesson about America's early years. The nation's expansion was never purely domestic. Every step westward was influenced by global politics, and every settlement could have ramifications far beyond its immediate surroundings. The young United States was simultaneously negotiating its identity, asserting sovereignty, and navigating a web of international interests that had persisted for centuries. Understanding this context is crucial to appreciating why the Northwest expansion was both an opportunity and a challenge, a frontier not only of land and resources but of diplomacy, strategy, and vision. By the end of this chapter, viewers should recognize that the Northwest Territory was not simply a space waiting for American settlers. It was a complex, contested region where global powers, indigenous nations, and the United States all vied for influence. Control over the Northwest meant economic advantage, strategic leverage, and political authority, making it a silent but critical battleground in the post-revolutionary era. The stage was set for the next chapter, the resistance of native nations determined to defend their homelands against this tide of expansion, and the conflicts that would test the young nation's resolve and ability to navigate a complicated, competitive world. As American settlers pushed into the Northwest Territory, they encountered not just wilderness but the enduring presence of indigenous nations who had lived on and shaped this land for centuries. The story of the Northwest expansion cannot be told without recognizing that native nations were not passive observers, but active agents defending their homelands, cultures, and political sovereignty. Leaders such as Little Turtle of the Miami, Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, and Tecumseh of the Shawnee Confederacy emerged as figures of remarkable strategy, vision, and resilience, determined to resist the encroachment of settlers and the growing influence of the United States. The Northwest Territory was home to a patchwork of indigenous nations, each with its own social structure, political hierarchy, and cultural traditions. For centuries, these nations had maintained complex networks of trade, diplomacy, and intertribal alliances, balancing relationships with one another and, increasingly, with European powers. When the United States began to assert control over the region, these nations faced an unprecedented threat. Land that had been cultivated, hunted, and governed according to centuries-old traditions was suddenly targeted for settlement, creating a direct conflict of interest that could not be ignored. Early confrontations were often sparked by the intrusion of settlers into native hunting grounds, forests and river valleys. Farms were cleared where villages once stood, and forts were constructed to enforce federal authority. While settlers saw progress, indigenous nations saw invasion. In response, native leaders formed strategic alliances and organized resistance movements that combined military skill with diplomacy. Little Turtle, a leader of the Miami, demonstrated remarkable tactical brilliance, orchestrating ambushes and counterattacks that inflicted heavy losses on U.S. forces in the early stages of the Northwest Indian War. His success highlighted that native forces were not merely defending land, they were challenging the young nation's military capability and asserting their own sovereignty. The resistance was not limited to individual battles. It was part of a broader effort to unite diverse tribes under a common purpose. The Western Confederacy, a coalition of various nations including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and Wyandot, sought to present a united front against American expansion. Leaders like Blue Jacket worked tirelessly to coordinate military strategies, negotiate alliances, and secure support from European powers, including the British, who had their own interests in keeping the Northwest contested. This confederacy represented a formidable challenge to the United States, as it combined knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and political savvy. Tecumseh, who would rise to prominence slightly later, embodied the vision of a pan-tribal resistance. He argued that no single tribe could survive the encroachment of settlers. Only a unified indigenous front could preserve their land, culture, and autonomy. Tecumseh's speeches and negotiations traveled far and wide, inspiring tribes across the region to see beyond local rivalries and recognize a shared fate. This vision of unity made him a figure feared by American policymakers, who understood that a coordinated indigenous resistance could threaten not only the Northwest Territory, but the broader ambitions of the United States. The conflict was further complicated by the involvement of European powers. The British, still maintaining forts in the region, provided weapons, supplies, and occasional strategic guidance to indigenous nations. This support was motivated not by altruism but by the desire to curb American expansion and protect British trade interests. The French influence, though more cultural and commercial, also reinforced networks that native leaders could leverage. As a result, battles in the Northwest were never purely local disputes. They were intersections of global and regional ambitions, where every victory or defeat had implications far beyond the immediate battlefield. Several key battles illustrate the intensity and sophistication of native resistance. In 1790 and 1791, Little Turtle led native forces to decisive victories against U.S. armies, demonstrating that the indigenous confederacy could challenge even trained soldiers. These early successes shocked American leaders and forced the federal government to reevaluate its strategy. Rather than relying on sporadic militias, the United States began to organize a more structured and professional military presence, recognizing that the Northwest would not yield easily to expansionist ambitions. These battles also sent a powerful message. The Northwest was not a blank canvas, and its indigenous defenders were both skilled and determined. Despite their resilience, native nations faced immense challenges. The relentless influx of settlers, coupled with disease, loss of resources, and superior numbers of the U.S. military over time, gradually eroded their ability to maintain control over the territory. Diplomacy often failed, treaties were frequently broken or ignored, and the balance of power shifted in favor of the United States. Yet the resistance was not in vain. It delayed American settlement, forced the federal government to adopt more organized and deliberate strategies, and preserved indigenous autonomy in pockets of the Northwest for decades. The legacy of this resistance is profound. It challenges the narrative of a peaceful, uncontested expansion and underscores the complexity of frontier life. The Northwest Territory was a space of negotiation, conflict, and adaptation, where indigenous nations actively shaped the trajectory of the young United States. Their leadership, strategy, and courage offer a counter-narrative to the simplified story of American settlement, highlighting that the expansion of the frontier was a contested, dynamic process. By the end of this chapter, viewers should understand that the Northwest expansion was not simply a tale of settlers moving westward. It was a confrontation between a young nation and the indigenous peoples who had stewarded the land for centuries. The native resistance was strategic, coordinated, and impactful, demonstrating that the frontier was not a void to be filled, but a landscape alive with politics, alliances, and determination. This resistance set the stage for the next chapter: how the United States responded to these challenges, crafting policies, military strategies, and settlements that would gradually transform the Northwest into a cornerstone of the nation. As the Northwest Territory simmered with resistance from indigenous nations and the subtle influence of European powers, the United States faced the formidable challenge of asserting control while promoting orderly settlement. Expansion into the Northwest was not simply a matter of individual pioneers staking claims. It was a carefully orchestrated political and administrative effort designed to integrate vast, contested lands into the young republic. The federal government, conscious of both the opportunities and dangers inherent in this region, implemented policies that would shape the trajectory of settlement, land ownership, and governance for generations to come. The cornerstone of this effort was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, legislation that provided a blueprint for governing territories and creating states. The ordinance outlined a step-by-step process by which territories could transition to statehood once they reached a population threshold, ensuring that settlement was organized and that governance followed a legal framework. It also prohibited slavery in the Northwest, setting a precedent for the region's future character and creating an early example of the tensions that would later shape American politics. Beyond these legal provisions, the ordinance emphasized civil liberties, guaranteeing freedom of religion and the right to a fair trial, reflecting the ideals of the young nation even as it sought to impose authority on a contested land. Land policies were equally crucial to the United States strategy. The government commissioned surveys of the territory, laying out the land in a grid of townships and sections. This meticulous planning not only facilitated orderly settlement but also provided a mechanism for selling land to settlers and speculators, generating revenue for the federal treasury. Veterans of the Revolutionary War were granted plots of land as payment for their service, while private investors purchased large tracts for development. The result was a deliberate effort to populate the region with individuals loyal to the United States and invested in the stability and prosperity of the frontier. Settlement itself became a tool of policy. Forts and garrisons were strategically placed to protect settlers from both native resistance and potential European intervention. Towns grew along rivers and lakes, forming hubs of commerce and governance. These settlements acted as both symbols and instruments of American authority, signaling that the United States intended not just to explore the Northwest, but to claim, organize, and ultimately govern it. Roads and trails were cleared to connect these communities, linking remote outposts to the eastern states and creating the infrastructure necessary for a functioning society. The push into the Northwest was accompanied by a combination of diplomacy and military force. Treaties with native nations, often negotiated under pressure or with limited understanding of indigenous concepts of land ownership, were used to secure territory and reduce conflict. In practice, many of these treaties were contested, ignored, or violated by settlers and government agents, leading to ongoing tension. Military campaigns, including the establishment of the Legion of the United States under General Anthony Wayne, were designed to enforce U.S. claims and quell resistance from indigenous confederacies. The decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 exemplified this dual approach, a combination of organized military action and subsequent treaties, most notably the Treaty of Greenville, secured large portions of the territory while formalizing American claims. Economic incentives played a critical role in shaping settlement patterns. Fertile land attracted farmers seeking subsistence and profit, while forests provided timber for construction and fuel. Rivers became trade arteries, allowing goods to flow to markets far beyond the frontier. The federal government encouraged investment in these resources, offering land at affordable prices and ensuring that infrastructure supported commerce. Merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs followed settlers, creating a web of economic activity that further solidified American presence in the region. This policy-driven expansion was not without controversy. Critics argued that the federal government sometimes overstepped its authority, imposing legal frameworks on territories inhabited by indigenous nations without their full consent. Conflicts between settlers and native populations persisted despite treaties, revealing the limits of policy in controlling on-the-ground realities. Nevertheless, the combination of legal structure, settlement incentives, and military presence gradually transformed the Northwest from a contested wilderness into a functioning, governed society aligned with the United States. The process of turning territory into states illustrated the long-term vision of American policymakers. Ohio became the first state carved from the Northwest Territory in 1803, followed by Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Each new state represented both the success of federal policy and the integration of frontier lands into the political and economic fabric of the nation. These states were not mere extensions of the East. They reflected lessons learned from conflict, negotiation, and settlement, embodying the nation's capacity to expand while maintaining order and governance. Cultural and social dynamics were also shaped by these policies. Settlers brought not only labor and commerce, but also ideas, institutions, and social structures that would define the region for generations. Town councils, schools, and churches emerged alongside farms and forts, creating communities that reflected both American ideals and the realities of frontier life. Over time, the Northwest Territory evolved from a contested wilderness into a landscape of organized communities, vibrant economies, and emerging political identities, even as it continued to be shaped by the lingering presence of indigenous nations and the strategic interests of foreign powers. By the end of this chapter, viewers should recognize that the United States' push into the Northwest was a deliberate, multifaceted effort. Expansion was not random or chaotic. It was guided by law, policy, and strategy, balancing settlement, governance, and military action. The Northwest Ordinance, land surveys, forts, and treaties formed the backbone of this approach, while economic incentives and infrastructure development ensured that American authority would endure. Yet this process also highlighted the challenges of expansion, ongoing conflicts with native nations, competing European interests, and the difficulties of imposing order on a vast and contested landscape. This chapter sets the stage for understanding how international and local pressures converged, leading to continued tension and shaping the trajectory of the young nation in the Northwest Territory. While the United States worked to establish governance and settlement in the Northwest Territory, the region remained a stage for global intrigue. The young nation's ambitions did not exist in isolation. European powers were still invested in shaping North America, and the Northwest became a subtle but significant arena of international tension. Understanding why other countries targeted this region requires recognizing both its strategic importance and its potential for wealth, trade, and influence. Control of the Northwest meant more than ownership of land. It meant dominance over trade routes, access to resources, and the ability to sway indigenous nations whose alliances could tip the balance of power in the continent. Britain remained the most persistent foreign influence. Despite the formal cession of the Northwest Territory to the United States under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, British forts lingered on the frontier, and their relationships with native nations continued to shape resistance to American settlement. For Britain, this was a calculated strategy. By supporting indigenous alliances with trade and occasional military assistance, they could check American expansion without resorting to outright war. These forts were not just military outposts. They were symbols of enduring British influence, places where trade, diplomacy, and intelligence converged. The British interest in the Northwest reflected both economic pragmatism and geopolitical strategy, ensuring that the United States would face constant pressure as it tried to consolidate control. France's role in the region was less overtly military but still significant. While France had ceded most of its North American territory in the mid-18th century, French traders maintained commercial networks that extended into the Northwest. These networks connected fur traders, settlers, and indigenous nations across a vast area, creating opportunities to influence alliances and maintain economic leverage. The presence of French traders complicated American efforts to monopolize trade, as indigenous nations often balanced their relationships between multiple European powers to protect their own interests. France's influence, though subtle, was a reminder that global rivalries continued to shape the frontier even as the United States pursued domestic expansion. Spain, controlling territories along the Mississippi River and in Louisiana, also viewed the Northwest as strategically significant. Though it did not occupy the Ohio Valley directly, Spanish control of the Mississippi allowed it to regulate trade and influence settlement patterns. Spanish officials closely monitored American activity, negotiating treaties and subtly encouraging native resistance to American encroachment where possible. For Spain, maintaining influence over the region was a way to secure its southern territories and assert its presence in North America, reminding the United States that expansion would not go unchallenged. The Russian Empire, though geographically distant, cast a long shadow along the northwest coast and in the Pacific Northwest. Russia's fur trading posts and territorial ambitions in Alaska and the Pacific made it a player in North American geopolitics, demonstrating that even remote territories could impact the strategic calculations of powers across the continent. The Northwest Territory, while far from Russian control, was part of a broader contest for influence in North America, showing that the region was never truly isolated from international considerations. Indigenous nations remained central to these tensions. Their strategic position in the Northwest made them critical partners or obstacles for any foreign power seeking influence. Leaders like Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and later Tecumseh were astute in recognizing the importance of European alliances, using these relationships to resist American expansion. By accepting weapons, supplies, or strategic guidance from Britain, indigenous nations effectively inserted themselves into the larger international contest, demonstrating that the struggle over the Northwest was not simply a local or national matter, but part of a complex web of global diplomacy. Trade was a key factor in international tensions. The Northwest rivers and lakes connected the interior of the continent to distant markets, and control over these routes meant economic leverage. Britain, France, and Spain each sought to protect or expand their trading influence, while the United States worked to establish new networks that would bind settlers and indigenous nations to its authority. These economic stakes were inseparable from military and diplomatic concerns. Whoever dominated trade could strengthen alliances, fund military operations, and project power across the region. Diplomacy and treaties became instruments of strategy as much as governance. The United States negotiated with both indigenous nations and European powers to assert claims, secure alliances, and reduce conflict. Treaties such as the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1794 helped clarify boundaries and trade relationships, though enforcement was often challenging. Similarly, agreements with native nations were designed to formalize land cessions and reduce armed resistance, yet they were frequently contested, reflecting the complexity of balancing local realities with international considerations. The interplay of international interests created a frontier that was dynamic, contested, and volatile. Every settlement, fort, or trading post could influence multiple parties simultaneously. A single battle or treaty could reverberate across borders, affecting relationships between the United States, Britain, France, Spain, Russia, and indigenous nations. This constant tension shaped American policy, forcing leaders to think strategically, balance diplomacy with force, and recognize that the Northwest was not merely a domestic concern but a critical component of broader geopolitical calculations. By the end of this chapter, viewers should understand that the Northwest Territory was a nexus of global competition. Control over the region offered economic wealth, strategic advantage, and political influence. drawing the attention of multiple nations even as the United States sought to consolidate authority. International tensions shaped settlement patterns, military strategy, and diplomatic decisions, highlighting that the Northwest expansion was as much about navigating global pressures as it was about domestic ambition. This sets the stage for the next chapter, where we examine how these competing interests intertwined with the struggles of settlers and native nations, creating a frontier defined by both conflict and negotiation. The Northwest Territory, while vast and rich with opportunity, was not peacefully won. As settlers advanced, indigenous nations, European powers, and the United States collided in a series of strategic battles that would shape the course of expansion. These confrontations were as much about asserting sovereignty and negotiating power as they were about territory, highlighting the high stakes of the frontier. Understanding these key battles provides insight into the resilience of native nations, the strategic thinking of European powers, and the challenges the United States faced as it sought to assert control over a contested region. One of the earliest and most significant confrontations occurred in 1790, during the campaign led by General Josiah Harmer against native confederacies in the Northwest. The U.S. forces, composed largely of militia and volunteers, underestimated both the tactical skill and cohesion of the indigenous warriors. Little Turtle, leading the Miami along with allies from the Shawnee, Delaware, and other tribes, orchestrated a decisive defeat for Harmer's army. This battle demonstrated the effectiveness of indigenous strategies, including ambush tactics, mobility, and intimate knowledge of the terrain, which outmatched the conventional European-style tactics of the fledgling American forces. A year later, in 1791, General Arthur St. Clair led a larger force into the Northwest Territory, seeking to suppress native resistance and establish American dominance. This campaign, however, ended in disaster at what is often called St. Clair's defeat. The Native Confederacy, again under Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, executed a coordinated and devastating attack, killing over 600 U.S. soldiers, one of the most significant defeats in American military history. The loss shocked the nation and underscored the formidable challenge posed by native resistance. It also forced the federal government to rethink its approach, moving from reliance on poorly trained militias to a more professional military structure capable of sustained campaigns. The response came in the form of the Legion of the United States, reorganized under the leadership of General Anthony Wayne. Wayne meticulously trained and disciplined his troops, emphasizing strategy, logistics, and coordination to counter the effectiveness of native tactics. This preparation culminated in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, a decisive confrontation that would mark a turning point in the Northwest expansion. Wayne's forces defeated the Native Confederacy, not through sheer numbers alone, but through careful planning, disciplined formations, and the ability to anticipate and counter ambush. This battle highlighted the evolution of American military strategy and its adaptation to the unique challenges of frontier warfare. Following the Battle of Fallen Timbers, diplomacy became the tool to consolidate military gains. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 formalized the cession of large portions of the Northwest Territory to the United States while reserving certain lands for native nations. This treaty did not end all conflict, but it significantly altered the balance of power in the region. Indigenous nations, though resilient, faced increasing pressure from both settlers and federal policies, and European powers like Britain and France found their influence in the area increasingly constrained by U.S. military and diplomatic strength. Other skirmishes and minor battles punctuated this period, often involving localized disputes over settlements, trade routes, or resources. These engagements, while smaller in scale, were critical in shaping the frontier. They forced settlers and military leaders to adapt, fostered negotiation and treaty-making, and continually tested alliances between indigenous nations and European powers. Each encounter underscored the reality that the Northwest was not a passive landscape to be claimed, but an active and contested space where strategy, diplomacy, and courage determined the outcome. The significance of these battles extends beyond mere territory. They represented a collision of cultures, technologies, and strategies. Indigenous forces relied on mobility, knowledge of the environment, and the ability to form rapid alliances across tribal lines. American forces, initially inexperienced, learned to combine European military discipline with frontier adaptability. These clashes also demonstrated that the Northwest was a microcosm of broader geopolitical tensions. Every victory or defeat influenced perceptions, negotiations, and ambitions, not only in the United States but also among European powers watching from afar. The psychological impact of these conflicts on both settlers and native nations was profound. For indigenous leaders, victories like St. Clair's defeat were a testament to their strength, unity, and strategic acumen. Yet repeated losses and the inexorable pressure of settlement gradually eroded the capacity to resist permanently. For American settlers, the initial defeats were sobering reminders of the challenges of frontier life, while the eventual victories under Wayne and the enforcement of treaties offered security and encouraged further migration into the Northwest. These battles shaped not only the political map but also the cultural memory of the frontier, influencing how both indigenous peoples and Americans perceived one another and their claims to the land. By the end of this chapter, viewers should understand that the Northwest expansion was achieved through a combination of diplomacy, policy, and military action. The key battles from Harmer and St. Clair's defeats to Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers illustrate the intensity of the conflict and the complexity of frontier warfare. These confrontations were not isolated events but part of a broader struggle involving indigenous nations, settlers, and European powers. The outcome set the stage for the eventual consolidation of American authority in the Northwest, demonstrating that expansion was never a simple or peaceful process, but rather a hard-fought and contested endeavor that required strategy, negotiation, and resilience. With the major military conflicts of the Northwest Territory largely resolved and treaties such as the Treaty of Greenville redefining boundaries, the focus of the region began to shift from conflict to settlement, development, and transformation. The Northwest was no longer merely a contested frontier, it was a land being actively shaped by human ambition, economic enterprise, and social organization. This period marked a profound transformation in the economic, cultural, and social fabric of the territory, laying the foundation for the states and communities that would eventually emerge from it. Economically, the Northwest became a hub of agricultural development and trade. The fertile soil of the Ohio Valley, southern Indiana, and Illinois attracted thousands of settlers eager to establish farms and cultivate crops for both subsistence and profit. Corn, wheat, and livestock became staples of the frontier economy, creating a self-sustaining agricultural network that supported growing settlements. Rivers and lakes played a critical role, serving as the arteries of trade and transportation. Goods could move efficiently from interior farms to markets in the east, connecting the frontier to the broader American economy. Early towns often sprang up near rivers or trading posts, serving as commercial hubs that facilitated both local and long-distance exchange. Timber was another key resource driving economic growth. The dense forests of the Northwest provided lumber for construction, fuel, and shipbuilding. Settlers, recognizing the commercial value of these resources, established sawmills and timber operations that supplied both local needs and markets further east. In addition, the fur trade, though declining from its peak during European competition, remained a lucrative enterprise for some traders and indigenous partners, linking the Northwest to global trade networks. The combination of agriculture, timber, and commerce established a diversified economy that made the region attractive to settlers and investors alike. Social transformation accompanied economic growth. As settlers moved into the Northwest, they brought not only labor but also cultural institutions, ideas, and governance structures. Towns developed social hierarchies and community organizations, including schools, churches, and town councils, reflecting the values and aspirations of the settlers. Education became a priority, with early schools teaching literacy, numeracy, and civic principles, helping to shape the identity and cohesion of frontier communities. Religious institutions, often established by settlers shortly after arrival, played both spiritual and social roles, creating a sense of shared purpose and moral order in otherwise challenging and unpredictable environments. The Northwest Territory also saw the emergence of legal and political structures that reflected the broader American system. The Northwest Ordinance had provided a legal framework for governance, but local adaptations were necessary to address the realities of frontier life. Courts, land registries, and municipal governments were established to resolve disputes, enforce contracts, and maintain order. These institutions helped integrate the region into the federal system, providing settlers with a sense of stability and reinforcing the authority of the United States over the formerly contested land. Political participation, though limited by modern standards, allowed settlers to shape local decisions, creating a participatory culture that would influence the emerging states. Demographically, the Northwest became a melting pot of cultures, including settlers from the eastern United States, European immigrants, and remaining indigenous populations. German, Irish, and other European groups contributed skills, traditions, and labor, enriching the cultural tapestry of the frontier. Indigenous nations, though increasingly displaced, continued to play economic and cultural roles, participating in trade, offering guidance on survival techniques, and occasionally negotiating land agreements or alliances. This diverse population contributed to a dynamic social environment, where interaction, cooperation, and conflict all played a part in shaping the frontier society. Economic and social transformation was not without tension. As settlers expanded agriculture in towns, indigenous communities were increasingly marginalized, their lands appropriated, and their influence diminished. Disputes over land, resources, and governance persisted, highlighting that transformation was often accompanied by displacement and inequality. Additionally, economic success was uneven. While some settlers prospered, others struggled with harsh conditions, unpredictable markets, and the challenges of establishing new livelihoods in a frontier environment. These tensions underscored the complexities of building a stable society in newly acquired and contested lands. Infrastructure development was another critical factor in the transformation. Roads, bridges, and canals were gradually constructed to connect settlements, facilitate trade, and support migration. These projects not only enabled economic growth but also helped solidify political and cultural connections between the Northwest and the eastern states. The creation of towns, marketplaces, and transportation networks reinforced the region's integration into the national economy, making the Northwest a critical link between the frontier and the established centers of commerce and governance. By the end of this period, the Northwest Territory had evolved into a landscape of opportunity and challenge, where economic innovation, social organization, and cultural adaptation intersected. The region's transformation demonstrated that expansion was not merely about acquiring land but about creating a functioning society capable of sustaining growth, governance, and cultural identity. Settlers and communities laid the groundwork for the states that would emerge from the Northwest, establishing patterns of agriculture, commerce, governance, and social cohesion that would persist for generations. By the end of this chapter, viewers should understand that the Northwest expansion was as much about economic development and social formation as it was about military conquest or diplomacy. The region's farms, towns, institutions, and communities reflected the ambitions, resilience, and adaptability of its settlers. Yet this transformation also came with costs: indigenous displacement, social tensions, and environmental change, all of which shaped the complex legacy of the Northwest Territory. The foundation was set for the final chapter, which explores the enduring impact and legacy of this untold saga, examining how the Northwest's history continues to influence America today. As the Northwest Territory transitioned from a contested frontier to a series of organized states, the story of America's expansion into this region became a foundation for the nation's identity, economy, and political trajectory. The legacy of the Northwest expansion is profound, reflecting a complex interplay of ambition, conflict, negotiation, and transformation. It demonstrates that the creation of the United States heartland was neither inevitable nor simple, but the result of decades of struggle, diplomacy, and determination by a wide array of actors from settlers and native nations to European powers and U.S. policymakers. One of the most enduring legacies is the establishment of governance and law. The Northwest Ordinance, which provided a legal framework for territorial administration, set precedents for how the United States would approach new lands. By outlining processes for statehood, protecting civil liberties, and prohibiting slavery in the region, it created a model that shaped the nation's expansion westward for decades. These policies reflected an early vision of federal authority balancing local autonomy, demonstrating that governance could guide settlement and development while maintaining national cohesion. The Northwest became a testing ground for ideas about democracy, citizenship, and the rule of law, setting standards that would influence the creation of future states. The Northwest expansion also left a lasting economic legacy. The transformation of forests into farmland, the development of river-based trade networks, and the establishment of towns and markets laid the groundwork for a thriving regional economy. Crops, timber, and later industrial production connected the region to national and international markets, creating a pattern of economic integration that persists today. The infrastructure roads, bridges, canals, and ports built during this period facilitated commerce and migration, supporting population growth and regional connectivity. Economically, the Northwest became a critical engine for the young nation, demonstrating the power of strategic settlement, resource management, and innovation in shaping prosperity. Culturally and socially, the Northwest was a crucible of adaptation and community building. Settlers brought diverse backgrounds, traditions, and skills, creating a dynamic and often multicultural society. Towns became centers of education, religion, and civic engagement, providing not only material sustenance but also social cohesion. Indigenous nations, though increasingly displaced, left a lasting imprint on the region, influencing place names, trade practices, and cultural memory. The interaction between settlers, native peoples, and immigrant communities created a unique frontier identity that blended resilience, ambition, and adaptation qualities that continue to define the Midwest today. The Northwest expansion also illustrates the human cost of growth. Indigenous nations suffered displacement, loss of sovereignty, and cultural disruption as settlement advanced. Conflicts, treaties, and broken agreements reshaped lives and communities, leaving legacies of tension and struggle that resonate in historical memory. Understanding this reality is critical. The expansion was not a purely triumphant story, but a complex narrative involving negotiation, resistance, and adaptation by multiple groups. Recognizing these dimensions adds depth to the story and ensures that the narrative honors those whose lives were most affected by the frontier's transformation. Geopolitically, the Northwest set precedents for American engagement with the wider world. The involvement of Britain, France, Spain, and even Russia demonstrated that territorial expansion was never solely a domestic affair. Managing international tension while consolidating authority within the territory required diplomacy, strategic planning, and sometimes military intervention. The lessons learned in the Northwest informed later American policies and approaches to expansion, illustrating the interplay between domestic development and global contexts that would continue to shape the nation. The physical landscape itself bears the imprint of this era. Rivers, lakes, and fertile plains that once provided lifelines to indigenous nations and fur traders became routes for settlement, agriculture, and commerce. Towns and cities that grew from frontier trading posts remain vital centers today. Roads and canals laid during the Northwest expansion provided the foundation for transportation, networks that facilitated the nation's westward growth. The very geography of the Midwest reflects the decisions, strategies, and struggles of this transformative period. Perhaps most importantly, the Northwest expansion embodies a story of vision and resilience. The settlers, policymakers, and military leaders who participated in this process were navigating unknown territory, facing environmental challenges, resistance from indigenous nations, and the pressure of competing international interests. Their efforts shaped not only the physical map of the United States, but also its political, economic, and cultural identity. The Northwest Territory demonstrates that nation-building is rarely linear or simple. It is an ongoing negotiation between opportunity, conflict, and ambition. As we reflect on this untold saga, the Northwest serves as a reminder of the complexities of history. Expansion was a dynamic process involving multiple actors with competing interests and visions. It was a story of both triumph and tragedy, of opportunity and displacement. The successes of settlement, governance, and economic development were inseparable from the struggles and resistance that defined the frontier. This duality, the promise, and the cost is central to understanding the American experience in the Northwest. Ultimately, the legacy of the Northwest expansion continues to shape the United States. The states born from this territory, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota, carry the economic, social, and political frameworks established during this period. The lessons learned about governance, diplomacy, military strategy, and community building resonate far beyond the region. And the stories of the people who inhabited this frontier, the settlers, the indigenous nations, and the European powers watching from afar, offer insight into the challenges of building a nation in a contested, dynamic world. By the conclusion of this chapter, viewers should understand that the Northwest expansion was not merely a chapter in American history, but a foundational saga that shaped the nation's identity, economy, and political landscape. It reveals the complexities of expansion, the resilience of those who lived it, and the enduring impact of the decisions made during this pivotal era. The Northwest reminds us that history is rarely simple or one-sided. It is a tapestry woven from ambition, resistance, diplomacy, and human endeavor, offering lessons that continue to resonate in the present day.